So, good morning to the 5 a.m. Mester Scrum Show to all the podcasters and YouTubers, and later on LinkedIn, we'll make cuts and put this out there. I have Karim Harbott, and he has his new book, The 6 Enablers of Business Agility, and how do we thrive in an uncertain, make sure I show your name there really good so you can see it. Now, Karim, I saw you speak years ago at the AgilePhilly Day. The presentation, the way you formatted, was awesome. You just tore those big giant sticky notes, and you went through everything. And I was really impressed to how you were so organized. Can you tell us about your journey to getting this where you are today?
So it's funny. I started my career off as a sort of mathematician by training, and then was a software engineer and project manager, right? Traditional project manager, right? So I worked in a kind of waterfall approach as a developer, and I was a traditional project manager. I was asked to become a Scrum Master in about late 2008, early 2009. I said, sure. I had not a clue what it was, right? But I'll give it a go. And it was one of those moments where I was like, I want to do that. That's what I want my job to be. I forget that. And so I threw myself into Scrum Mastering, for, if that's a verb, for many years, like 5 or 6 years, like in the trenches with teams for sort of good 6 years, 5, 6 years. And it became clear that what I was doing there was impactful, but it wasn't as impactful. Teams have some challenges, right? But the challenges that they face rarely sit inside the team. The kind of the big impediments are way beyond the scope of the team. Right. So I just found it more interesting to start tackling those. Mm-hmm. And the way my brain works is I love to group and categorize information. It was like, make sure I'm not missing stuff, right? I love checklists, I love groups. And I ended up just collecting all of these tools and techniques over the next 6-7 years of my agile coaching, which is more organizationally focused. Brought that into a model and a framework, and I was looking at early versions of it, included loads of stuff, and just sort of sliced it and diced it differently. And when I started training agile leadership, really focused in on it, and it ended up just being 6 key areas, right, which I called the 6 impediments to business agility, until I was told to stop being so grumpy and make it more positive. So it became the 6 enablers, and then it turned into a book. So really, it's been a kind of evolution of my journey, but also the way my brain likes to categorize information really has led to this.
Okay. And that leads me right into the next one. Tell us a little bit about your journey to write a book, specifically this book, right? And your journey of your first book.
I never wanted to write a book, and then that's one of the first things I say in the introduction. Like, it was never been an ambition of mine to write a book. I can't think of anything worse. I very specifically studied subjects my whole life which avoided writing essays. Mathematics, became a software engineer. I was like, please don't make me write stuff. Now, how did it happen? It's funny. So once I evolved the model, and it was a consulting model, right? It was never supposed to be anything else. It was initially my wife that said, you should turn this into a book. And I did one of those. I'm never going to do that. But if I were to do it, what might the structure be? And I kind of just drew out, I put the chapters on paper. That was my mistake. Never put something on paper if you don't want to do it, because your brain's going to make you do it in some way, right? Yeah. The stars will align to make it happen. And so I put it on paper, put it in the proverbial drawer, forgot about it. Then I was giving a talk at the Scrum gathering in Austin. Right. So this was, 2019 maybe. And there was a lady there from a publishing company. She liked the talk, and she said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I have, and here's what it would look like. But I'm never going to do it.
So all your stars are aligning in that, right?
I said, but I'm never going to do it, right? This is kind of May 2019. And she said, this sounds really interesting. How about you fill out this proposal? And so I filled out the proposal, and then I was like, I'm still not going to do that. And then they said, we want to publish this. Will you do it? And then I just did it for some reason, had a Russia blood to the head, and I signed the contracts to write a book. And then I had to write the thing, but I was off to a bit of a head start, because I'd been gathering so much content and so many stories in each of these chapters, what became chapters, through my training and through my consulting, that really I had the content, and all I had to do was turn it into a coherent structure and prose, and throw stories and analogies in from over. So it wasn't like I was starting from scratch. I had it all. It was more pulling it together and researching and finding the sources, turning it into a book from a person who's never written an essay, never mind a book, right? And so a massive, massive learning curve. But in doing so, I really clarified, and I find it an incredibly valuable. If anyone's thinking about doing it, it's both painful and incredibly valuable in equal measure. And it really makes you focus and clarify, what is it I'm trying to say? What's important? What's not important? And in that sense, it was an amazing experience. I kind of hope I don't ever do it again, though.
Though it's funny you said, we were talking a little bit earlier about how your wife is like, first book? So she was the one that started this journey. So you said the word, you said something about writing your first book.
I did say that. So she encouraged me. And again, this is back in probably early 2019. She said, you should write this thing. Right. And I was like, zero chance I do that. And the thing is, like, the way the stars aligned, I signed the contract in kind of October 2019. Right. And, by February 2020, there was a global pandemic. Right. My kids were not going to school. My wife became teacher to both of them. And I was stuck out here writing this book that I just said I would write. Right. So I think it wasn't ideal. So it became maybe a little more stressful than we planned it to be. And I've probably got a few more grays down the side here than I ever thought I would. So anyway, when it came out, I posted about this on Facebook, and it's about the only social media that my wife would see my posts on, because she's not on LinkedIn or Twitter or anything. And I said, just published my first book. And my wife just literally, the first comment was, "First book, question mark, question mark, question mark." Like, we are not doing this again.
But she started you on this journey too, right? So it's like, hey, it's just your journey here. You started me down a track, right? So that's great. In your book, can you give us one of your favorite stories out of the book?
Yeah, I tried to bring in a lot of stories now, and a lot of the ones about sort of leadership and organizational transformations. People might be familiar with, or some will be familiar with some of them. But the one that I like is more of an analogy than a story, right? And it's the analogy of there's a lot of evidence out there to suggest that over time, mammals in particular get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? They're kind of evolved to be big. There's a competitive advantage to being big when you've got a stable environment there, and we get bigger and bigger and bigger, and so we had 2-ton wombats lumbering around, and these big saber-toothed cats, the enormous dinosaurs. Right? But the really interesting thing here is, whilst there is a competitive advantage in that, when there is a dramatic change in the environment, right? Like what happened 66 million years ago at the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event, when an asteroid slammed into the Gulf of Mexico. Right? Almost everything that survived that impact, and only 25% of plants and animals did survive, by the way. 75% were wiped out,
right,
including the dinosaurs. But of the 25% that survived, almost none of them weighed more than 25 kilograms. That's about 55 pounds for you folks, right? They were all small, like cat size and below, rodents and things. And it turns out that when there's a period of stability, scale is really important. When there is a dramatic change in the environment, being nimble, as we know, is important, right? And the ability to quickly adapt and reproduce in a new environment. And it was the smaller creatures that were able to do that. And it's such a nice analogy for the 20th century, with a period of stability where size and scale and economies of scope and scale led to your competitive advantage, to now when we've got this really turbulent, volatile, complex environment. And it is those that exhibit business agility and innovation that survive and thrive. It doesn't matter. It's not big versus small anymore. It's nimble versus not nimble. And I just really like the parallel there. And let's sort of start one of the chapters off by talking about that, because it really struck me as being something that really drives home what we talk about.
That's funny you say that. I started a program called Thinking into Results. And one of the examples he talks about, all these big companies have these small innovation groups that make the transformation, that get it to the next stage. So what you just said is spot on for what he was saying about being the small group in these giant behemoths of a company that really move the needle. So it's kind of interesting you said that.
Yeah, okay. You need to be both small and far enough away to not get sucked into the bureaucratic machine, right? That's important.
Okay, cool. That'll lead into another question. So we have 6 enablers here, right? 6 enablers. Can you have business agility without all 6 being in process?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot because often like people who come on my training are like, what can I do if I can't change that? Because we can't, like, the finance director isn't on board or the HR director isn't on board. And for me, like, you can always move the needle, right?
Right.
But I like the analogy of an athlete, right? What do you need if you're a professional athlete? You need good technique. You need good mental strength, right? You need physical strength, stamina, flexibility. You need the right diet. Now, let's say Michael Jordan, right? This is quite a big sports star. Everybody knows. If you'd have said, you know what, I'm just going to leave out one of those. I'm not going to eat well. I'm going to do everything else, but I'm not going to eat well, right? Yeah. Would he be the man we all know today? Or I'm going to do everything else, but I'm just not going to work on my technique. So yes, you can probably be better than you are with just 4 or 5 of them. Will you ever be great? The answer is, for me, I've never seen it happen. And if you look at all of the most effective organizations on the planet, in some way, they are doing something that works for them in each of those areas. So, like I said, it depends what your ambition is and how effective you want to be. But really, the secret sauce is they all work together in a coherent, consistent way to sort of in the direction that you want to go. So that's been my experience.
That's funny. As you were talking that, you brought the sports analogy. I was thinking rugby. Because what? You do a lot of scrum, right? And I used to play rugby back in the day, and now you can think of it, okay, you'd be a rugby player. They're huge now. They're all strong and a lot bigger than I was. And, they're 250 pounds. They got muscles. But you know what? They can also jog 5-6 miles every day. They need they want the strength, but they need the endurance because they can't stop. Yeah. They keep going. So you need that. So what you said, that have that all-around training in all 6 enablers, anybody on a rugby team, there's probably 6 or 7 things they got to work on every day.
Oh, for sure. I bring in sport because, I used to be a professional athlete. Tennis was my game, right?
Okay.
Now, obviously, I wasn't very good, which is why I do this for a living. But I certainly spent a lot of my youth doing that. And there's so much that you don't even think about. And we used to spend hours with sports psychologists just working on how you can perform when you're under stress. Right? Most people don't see that side of it. They see kind of the other side. So, there's so much you need to think about. And people just focus on this, but actually you've got to broaden your perspective.
And you probably had coaches for every one of those aspects of the game, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. Physical coaches, flexibility coaches, technical coaches, mental brain, like everything, separate person, because there's no one who knows all of those things. Right.
You bring it, and it's you talk about helping these corporates. Is a lot of times you're like, I just want a coach to help start off and say, you don't understand, it's a long journey. There's a lot of stuff to get coached on. They're like, what? Really? So I love your 6 enablers because it now gets them thinking about these different areas. Okay. I was looking at your book. You wrote down, I thought this was of all the areas that really just stuck out with me was governance and funding. I always hear that, but you actually wrote it down and why this part is important. And I'm curious, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I'd love to, Greg. And that's the one that people always be like, huh? Because leadership, like we know about agile leadership. We know that culture is important. We know that like team structures are important. We know that people and HR side is important. Processes, practices, frameworks, or what I call ways of working is important. But governance and funding, and here's why, right? This comes up on my Scrum classes, never mind like when we're talking about enterprise agility. Why? Because every organization I've worked with, almost at the start of the journey at least, they work on projects with fixed scope, fixed budgets, fixed delivery dates, right? And when you've got I get this number one question I get in my Scrum classes: how can we be agile if we've got a fixed scope and a fixed deadline? Right? Let me rephrase that. How can I respond to change while simultaneously not responding to change is what you're saying there, right? And of course, you can see the answer is not a chance. Right. So this whole mentality of I'm going to get a fixed scope and then deliver against it is very much assuming we know exactly what that fixed scope should be, which is we know is very difficult when we're in the complex space. That's why the whole agile movement emerged for software development. But now we're just saying, whatever you're doing, if it's highly complex and unpredictable, there needs to be a more experimental approach, learning as you go. So things like lean startup, design thinking, getting in working with the customer, build, measure, learn, inspect and adapt. And if your governance process doesn't allow that, it's over before you even start, right? If you don't allow running multiple experiments, killing those cheaply that don't work, doubling down on those that do, all the while collaborating with your customer and evolving the solution based on the feedback you get. Most organizations are structurally designed for that to not happen. They've got, I did whole modules on change control when I was a project manager.
Yes,
it's basically, how can we not learn from what we're doing? And if you've got that model in place, you're never going to get any level of agility. So, we cannot avoid that conversation with finance or PMO or governance or whoever it is that controls that model to say, hey, we need to approach this differently. And so that's why it's there. It's just an important part of the journey.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting you brought that up, because I always hear about funding teams get continuous funding and not this project management type funding thing. And I just thought it was the timeliness of what you brought that topic to the forefront. I thought that was pretty interesting. Okay, how can people buy your book, find you?
They can
buy this book. Oops, upside down. There we go.
Well, whatever your favorite retailer is, I'm going to assume that a good chunk of people are going to be on a certain book retailer called Amazon, and you'll find it on Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk, Amazon. Whatever it is in your country, right? It's there. I have a little website called 6enablers.com where you can find out a bit more information. I've got a bunch of free downloads on there as well, which some people find quite useful. Check that out. But basically, all of the major retailers, there's an Audible and an audio book, which I hear you were listening to with and a voice which is almost certainly not mine.
Yes, but that was the part I enjoyed. I just got to giggle out of that one. That was funny.
Yeah, so he's a very, very well-spoken BBC newsreader reading it. So it's definitely not me with my North London twang, but he reads it well. You've got the Kindle version, Apple Books, wherever you like. But it's out there, thankfully, and I don't have to continue writing it. Although maybe there'll be a second edition one day.
Yeah, and definitely. And if you make a second edition, you're going to come on the show, right? Because by then we're going to have thousands of episodes. We're going to be world famous. We're going to get you out there, and we're going to promote your second.
I think it still counts as my first book if it's a second edition, so I can get around that whole first book issue.
Oh, yeah, you go. That'll. Yeah, Hans, first book.
Still the first one.
It's the only book. It's the only book. I just make new additions to it. Okay.
This is incremental. Release 2.
I love it. Okay. So on the 5 a.m. Mester Scrum show on Fridays, we do a fortune cookie Friday. And what I have is these things called Agile accountants. And the way you would set the governance compliance, got to have certain fields in your system. You got to have it all written out. If you don't have it, we're going to gig you. We're going to audit against you. So those are those Agile accountants that say, your user story should be as so-and-so, I want so that. And if you don't have that in your description, you fail the Agile accounting test, right? You know this, people, right?
Yes, I do.
So here's the fortune cookie. It's been double sealed by the Agile accountant. So we got a plastic cover, and inside is a cookie, a story. And what we're going to do here is we're going to pull whatever message from the Agile accountants, and your job is to apply that to your book. So this will be a totally new thing. So I'm going to open this up. And now I usually have to take my glasses off so I can read it. See, at least you still have hair. It may be turning gray, but mine's gone. And my eyes are going bad. Okay. Ooh. Okay. The greatest truths are the simplest, and so are the greatest people. So the greatest truths are the simplest, and so are the greatest people. So how can you apply that to your book? Thinking about the 6 enablers of business agility.
The greatest truths are the simplest. Many people have spoken about, it's easy to add complexity, right? To add another role, to add another department, to add another silo, to add another person who is coordinating, right? But if I apply that to one chapter of the book, it's going to be organizational structure, right? Because the greatest structures tend to be the simplest. And so, you've got to, it's not rocket science. We've got a team. They are cross-functional. They are autonomous. They interact with other cross-functional autonomous teams. We don't need this complex structures of coordinators and interfaces and governance and rules. We just need empowered teams that can interact with each other, right? And in that sense, people often say to me, but my organization is so complex, right? And I say, you're complex because you designed to be complex.
Yes.
Right? The most effective designs are the simplest ones, right? And so the greatest truth, the greatest organizational designs are the simplest, right. I'd say. Right? And I say go with simplicity and add complexity only when you have to. That's how I can manage to tenuously link that to my book.
That's perfect. Right, spot on. And we'll go with that.